Nanaimo Ladysmith.
I'm sorry that we are here tonight. I'm sorry to Colton Boushie's family. I'm sorry that in a time of deep grieving they had to come to Ottawa to meet with this government. I'm grateful for the generosity of their time and for the very strong voice of Colton's sister in particular, I think a future leader of our country. I'm sickened by the racist language in social media and on our radio networks that's been unleashed by this. I'm horrified. And I see a lot of nodding heads from all parties here. What we're hearing in our country is sadly summed up by my colleague, friend, and former Nanaimo chief in Nanaimo Ladysmith, where I'm honoured to serve. A former Nanaimo chief, Colton, also known as Doug White III, he said on behalf of the BC Aboriginal Justice Council in the wake of this ruling, quote, "The reality of this verdict drags Canada's justice system out from behind the window dressing of reconciliation rhetoric and exposes real problems that we must urgently address together." Today, Canadians across the country are doubting whether this justice system that clearly discounts the lives of Indigenous people has anything at all to do with justice, end quote. With my colleagues from all parties at Status of Women Committee, we've been studying the experience of Indigenous women in Canada in the justice system and in the incarceration system. Indigenous women make up 30% of the total incarcerated population in Canada. Federally sentenced prisoners, 36% of them are Indigenous women. Here's one witness we've had at committee describe their experience. This is Vicky Chartrand from Bishop's University. Quote, "Indigenous women end up in the deepest end of the system and continue to be subject to some of the most restrictive levels of penal practices, such as maximum security classifications, segregations, involuntary transfers, physical restraints, strip searches, lockdowns, use of force, dry cells, institutional charges, lack of medical attention, also with higher rates of self-harm and suicide. When you end up in the deep end of the system, you often don't come out alive," end quote. Mandatory minimums still exist in this country. The Liberal government promised to end them. They have not taken that power. And Indigenous women, because judges can no longer exercise their judicial discretion, are being forced to serve time for a crime they may well be an accessory to. It is putting their children into foster care, and this country is carrying on its tragic and destructive history of separating Indigenous parents from their children. Why this could not have been done on day one of this government's term in office, I have no idea. We've had recommendations from the United Nations Committee to End Discrimination Against Women in 2016. I've been asking every witness at committee, are your recommendations on Indigenous women in the justice system being addressed by this government? They all say no. 17 of the 94 calls to action in the Truth of Reconciliation Commission are specifically focused on Indigenous people's experience in the justice system. Again, witnesses at our Status of Women Committee are saying really no progress. In 2 years, with all the goodwill in the world, I don't understand why. Dr. Ivan Zinger, Office of the Correctional Officer, said, quote, "I will say the practice of taking a woman with acute mental illness and putting her into an all-male institution, complete isolation, all alone in a unit, is shameful and a violation of human rights. I think there is no room for this in Canada." When do we have bureaucrats saying such appalling and condemning things about our government in Canada? And this, again, is not a practice that has been ended by correctional services in Canada, not been ordered to be ended by this government. And so, Mr. Speaker, you'll forgive me if I say this country cannot afford any more just good intentions. To go back to the old food aid concerts, words are not enough. This government has got so much goodwill. They've got this House with us. We've made promises and commitments on reconciliation. And now with rulings like we've had, with the racism that's being unleashed across the country, we must turn these good intentions into action. We must do better. But I can't even say do better. We must legislate, which must change our rules. We must bring legislation into this House that turns good words into action. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable colleague and neighbour from Nanaimo, Ladysmith, for her remarks. I completely agree that we need to remove mandatory minimums from our criminal justice legislation. I introduced, let's see now, it's almost 2 years ago, a private member's bill, Bill C-269. It was a lot of work, actually, to cull all the individual mandatory minimums that have been brought in under the Harper era, put them in one private member's bill, to make it easy to get rid of all of them, except for those for the most serious of crimes where we wouldn't want to remove them. I also note that the situation on Vancouver Island for Indigenous women is particularly egregious, and I want to open the opportunity for my colleague to speak to this, of the lack of remand centres for Indigenous women on Vancouver Island and the additional specific discriminatory treatment that they face due to this lack of facilities, and ask her if she'd like to comment further on the systemic discrimination in criminal justice, particularly as it applies to us locally on Vancouver Island.
The honourable member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thank you to my colleague. The separation of Indigenous women from their communities and families when they have to leave our region to be incarcerated in other facilities, it compounds the problems that got them into the justice system in the first place. They become increasingly isolated. But we heard a very interesting circularity from a number of the witnesses. GLADU reports, which are supposed to bring additional considerations around maybe the impact of residential school or of children being in foster care into sentencing. The Indigenous women at committee are telling us this is giving, the GLADU reports are having the opposite effect. They're giving them they're identifying them as a higher risk inmate. They're putting them into more isolation and more segregation, which makes them unable to participate in the programming that happens within the jails, which makes them ineligible for the nice earlier parole, the controlled release from prison, which means that they are even more likely to be dislocated from their families, dislocated from their culture, and maybe more likely to reoffend. It's a mess, and this government has got work to do. We want to work with them together.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for her speech tonight. I wanted to ask for her comments on the ways in which we support victims in general in the criminal justice system. I know we may have some disagreements about particulars in terms of how to approach these issues, but supporting victims was one aspect of the system that was very important to our last Conservative government. We did things like pass a Victims' Bill of Rights. Specifically, when you have things happen to people as a result of criminality, what can the government, the federal government, do more to support those who are victims, to provide them with resources and supports, and ensuring that those supports are culturally appropriate, are responsive to what may be the particular needs of victims from Indigenous communities?
The honourable member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
I've lost track at committee of the number of witnesses that have said the first thing that we should do that would make things better for Indigenous women in the justice system and incarceration is to undo the damage done by the Conservative government by imposing mandatory minimum sentencing. It took away judicial discretion. It's breaking women from their families. It is perpetuating interruption in parenting, and it's inhumane, and we're way out of step with the rest of the world on this. We want to see it undone. We want to see the Liberal government, 2 years into their mandate, actually keep their campaign promise in this regard.
Questions and comments? The other honourable member for Courtenay Alberni. We have questions.
Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my good friend from Nanaimo, Ladysmith, for her important work. One thing that my colleague from Victoria talked about, the peremptory challenges that take place in jury selection. I think that this terrible tragedy and certainly this court case has shined a light on something I think most regular Canadians didn't even know existed, that the Crown prosecutor or the defence can remove somebody from jury selection just for the color of their skin or what they look like. I mean, this is something that crosses all political lines. It's clear that it's injustice, and maybe the member can speak about the urgency that the government needs to take to fix this and remove this provision.
The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith in 30 seconds or less, please.
Thank you. I will echo the words of my colleague, New Democrat Member of Parliament for Abitibi Bay James, Nunavut EU. There are a lot of things that can be done by this government with the majority that they have and the good intentions that they have. We appreciate the Prime Minister's words, but they mean nothing unless he really acts on it. He said again and again, let's make sure it happens for real this time. We need action and implementation starting tomorrow.